Hi, Misha here. Want to talk about a nightmare, an abortion? The British Sten gun, again, because another one came in. Nothing particularly unique or special. It's just a Sten Mark III built as a carbine from MAKARMS, formerly MK gun mods. Just fun. The parts kits are still available, 9mm. This one has the so-called loop stock, but because of how easily these remove, you can put a T-stock on if you prefer. And last year, I showed you this one, which I had built as a pistol because it had the receiver mostly intact. This is another Mark III, although this is a C model, so there are some differences. Of course, this has the original 7.8-inch barrel, and it has the so-called commando pistol grip, complete with a little sling loopy-doop. Kind of neat. There we go. Without a stock on, you gotta kind of crank her back. And with these semi-autos, what once was the selector for full or semi is now safe and standard. And we do have the J-hook notch here. And these are striker fired using the original trigger group. Just kind of fun, silly, but oh, such an iconic historical gun. So with that, why don't we dive back into the Sten? It's been a while since we talked about it. And before we jump in, you know the routine. If you could, please like, share, and subscribe. Please do comment. Comments are always fun. And if you really like to help support us, check out the link to the Patreon page. With that, let's go back to 1920s and 30s Britain. The Sten story actually begins here with the Lanchester submachine gun. Really Britain's first domestically produced, although not really designed, submachine guns. After World War II kicked off, September 1939, Britain found itself with a shortage of all kinds of guns, especially submachine guns. By 1940, they were buying Thompsons from the USA, but these were very expensive, and of course you had to get them across the Atlantic. Even at their lowest point, they were still paying over $70 per Thompson, which in 1940, on a war budget, that's a lot of money. Plus, the Thompson fired 45 ACP, common cartridge in North America, not very common in Europe. Then the whole events with the invasion of France and the loss of British, well, mostly equipment, some forces, the whole thing there with Dunkirk, they needed something and needed it fast after May of 1940. So they ordered that Britain essentially tool up and make a copy of the German MP-28-2 Bergmann, which itself was an evolution of the MP-18, really the first submachine gun, arguably, in World War I. So this really is mostly a Bergmann. Now the name Lanchester comes from George Lanchester, who worked at Sterling, who actually built these. They were approved in August of 1940 and were in production by the beginning of 1941, and initially 50,000 were ordered, primarily to go to the Royal Navy. The idea, this was to be used for boarding parties and landing parties, going on shore, as well as just general defense. But then the British Air Force expressed some interest, the RAF, mostly for guard duty, also prisoner herding duty, which is kind of why it has one of its kind of neat features. Well, the initial order was for 50,000. Ultimately, they would build about 90, some sources say 100,000, at 2 different Sterling factories. So let's talk about the features of this here GAT. This fires what would basically be the default standard 9x19 9mm parabellum Luger. It is 33.5 inches long, tip to tip. It weighs about 9.5 pounds unloaded and has an 8-inch barrel. This is a display barrel in this one. Notice how the shroud comes all the way out. It fed from this giant mag here, 50 rounds. This is based on the MP18, MP28 stick mag. So it's double column, single feed, and a straight mag at that. So it would actually inherit quite a few problems. Standard loadout would be 3 of these mags for a total of 150 rounds in a special mag pouch rig. Unfortunately today these mags are very hard to come by. And here it is in the gun. Well, the good news is you can still lay prone. And I guess the other good news is you're at least going to have about 2 feet between you and the next guy. So we talked about it has a full shroud. This is part of the receiver tube. We have a protected front sight. We have a brass magwell. And we have an adjustable rear sight, at least initially. We also have a fire mode selector and a wooden stock. Flip this over. The stock was very much patterned after the Lee infield with the very noticeable semi-pistol grip. Has a brass butt plate with storage compartment for a cleaning rope and brass oiler. Disassembly is very simple. Flip this lever over and it hinges open. And you can get to the cap. Finger grooves here. Magazine. And then this thing here. Like I said a minute ago, one of the notions for this was to guard prisoners. So it had a complete bayonet mount. Sterling's Lanchester could take the pattern 1907 sword bayonet from the Lee infield here, making it quite effective. I'll give it that. And it locks on very secure and unique. Had to take the magazine out because it was a little cumbersome. And here it is from the other side, just because. So the original Mark I had those features, but the war was progressing, and eventually we would get the Mark I Star, a simplified version, and there would be several changes. For one, the select fire would go away, just a full auto. For another, at least with some, the magazine housing would go from brass to steel. I think some of the butt plates were also steel. I've seen a few different variations in the stock, but probably the most noticeable difference, the Mark I Star went to a simplified 100-200 yard flip rear sight instead of a fully adjustable. But otherwise, this is a very standard submachine gun. Blowback, open bolt, J-notch. Yeah. So even though externally it looks quite polished, and these were well made, internally, well, it and the Sten share a lot in common with their same Bergman root parent. While the Lanchester gave very good service, these were pretty expensive to build and produce, at least by war standards, in 1940. So already they were looking for something quicker, easier to produce. But Lanchester orders would continue. In fact, the last order was placed in October of 1943, with the final deliveries by 1945, maybe late 1944. And they would remain in mostly Royal Navy service through the 1950s, being sold out in the early 60s, but they would serve for quite a while. You could understand why this longer, heavier gun with a giant magazine would be kind of good for shipboard operations, but it wasn't good for producing hundreds of thousands for the Army and for export to fight a potential German invasion. And thus, we get the Sten Mark I. To talk about the Mark I Sten, the best I've got to offer is returning to this Mark III here with the loop stock. because really this is a greatly simplified version of a Mark I. Like I said, in the summer of 1940, with everything going on, the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield was ordered to make something that could be just built basically for as close to $0 as humanly possible and required unskilled labor and as few machine parts as possible. And the task primarily fell to Major Reginald Shepherd and Harold Turpin, two of the most British names ever. And as is famously known, that's where the S and T in Sten comes from, combined with the E end from Enfield, because S-T-E would not really make sense. And we received the Mark I Sten gun. Testing would begin in January of 1941. Some problems were identified. It would continue up until March and April, and it was ordered into production, and the Mark I was officially adopted in June of 1941. And it really was just a simplified MP18 Lanchester. It was reduced to about 30 inches overall with a 7.8-inch barrel. Weight would drop down. Various marks had their various weights, but it was certainly lighter than the Lanchester. And the initial Mark I featured a stock not dissimilar to this. We call it a skeleton stock. It had a single-piece receiver tube, much like this, with the barrel protruding. It did have a vertical grip, first made of wood, and it had a very basic muzzle brake, kind of a spoon style on the end. Of course, it was select fire, safe. It was done by the J-hook up here, and the select fire was down here where I showed you earlier, semi and full. Simplified trigger system, open bolt, basic sights. But they only made about 100,000 Mark Is. It was soon replaced by the Mark I Star, which would kind of do away with the wood foregrip and the muzzle device, the muzzle brake, and just kind of go on towards simplifying the design. And they would build 200,000 Mark I Stars, and Enfield was joined by, of all things, Singer sewing machines. The Mark I Star, was primarily designed for ground forces, and it took about 12 man-hours to build. But it was produced in a way that many off-the-shelf components could be used if necessary. For example, the tubing was more or less standard diameter for plumbing, and there were only a few machined parts initially, like the bolt, the trunnion, the barrel. The tube itself was just a simple tube. But of course things would change. And there was also a need for the Air Force, for the airborne, and special forces. Enter the Sten Mark II. And I apologize in advance, this one has the extended barrel. I don't know where my display barrel is for this one. I looked and looked. Probably wasting a lot more time than I should have. Oh well. Normally the barrel would stick out about 3 inches, and was still 7.8 inches overall. But the receiver became a two-piece affair, with the shroud first being shortened and able to unscrew from, and we ended up with this rotating magwell here. And it would continue use of the loop stock, at least initially. And this one even has the clip for the cleaning rod to fit inside. This would later be done away with. Some would have a little bar in there for the sling to wrap around. This one does not. And the front of the sling is just a little hook. I've even seen some slings where they used a nail for this hook. And it would still be the simple blowback system, select fire. And as to the magazines, Lanchester on bottom, Sten on top. The Sten is the same magazine style, just reduced from 50 rounds to 32. So it's still that German style double stack, single feed, which actually would require a tool to load and would lead to some issues. But yeah, these were designed for airborne so they could easily be disassembled and put back together, or special forces, covert operations, basically just a more concealable version. Also with the Mark II compared to the Mark I Star, they would continue to streamline production, dropping man hours below 10 and 9. It has the simple fixed rear sight and front sight, more stampings, so on and so forth. Here is a paratrooper case for the Sten Mark II. It holds 4 magazines here, and it has a pocket just for the ever important loading tool there. I have a couple of different styles, including the spoon style, but here's the slightly more ornate box style. But you really do need one of these for the Sten gun. Some kind of loading tools is a prerequisite. And there are many different patterns and types, and they're kind of scattered all over my place, but it fits in there in a little pocket. So basically it would be in 3 pieces. You'd have the barrel shroud, you'd have the main receiver piece with the magwell folded down, and you'd have the buttstock. That could be easily detached. There's a spring-loaded thing here. All Stens have easily removable buttstocks instead of folding. That was kind of their compromise. And you can just simply rotate the magwell. Set you down for 1 sec. Into position if it wants to play nice today. Or not. There we go. A little sticky. Probably haven't rotated it in a minute. And then you could just stick your mag in and you were good to go. Just now off camera, the magwell rotated 3 or 4 times perfectly. I think it was just stuck. We've had a lot of weather changes here, so I've noticed a lot of metal is swelling and contracting. So flipping it over, I wanted to point out that this has a brass or bronze bolt in this build. And that was done for resource purposes. Some say that they were used for silenced guns, suppressed guns. I could see that, a little quieter. But they were also used just because of resources too, and it was easier to work with. Although there would be issues with these. So these would go into production in 1941. They would be testing in the summer of that year, around the time the Mark I was going into service, and they would be adopted later on. And like I said, these were for the airborne. The Mark I was more for the infantry. And the Sten's first major outing was in 1942 for the Dieppe raid. Not a good raid for the British, but it showed the Sten was at least usable in combat. Several factories outside of Enfield would make the Mark II, including Fazakerley and BSA, Birmingham Small Arms, as well as Long Branch in Canada. In fact, the first order for these was actually placed with Long Branch in August of 1941, even before Enfield was making them, because they were still doing other things. And this would be the most produced version, with roughly 2.6 million made by war's end. And now we wrap around to the Mark III. We can talk about it proper like. Back in the 1940s, using stamped metal in manufacturing was a bit of a specialized skill. Not all companies had it. In the UK, manufacturer of toys, bicycles, a few other things like that, Lyons Brothers was kind of ahead of the game. Towards the end of 1941, they started looking at the Mark II, and they felt that they could make something even cheaper and faster to produce. So going back to the Mark I pattern, they offered what we would know as the Mark III. It first entered testing in January of 1942, and was officially adopted around April of that year, and would be produced primarily by that company, with the manufacturing lasting through 1943 at the very least. The Mark III again returned to the single-piece receiver. It was basically just a simplified Mark I, again intended more for infantry. Having the fixed magwell instead of the adjustable did add a little bit of reliability compared to the Mark II, Yeah, it was mostly about being cheaper. This really got down to a lot of stampings. For example, the actual tube itself is formed from a stamping. It's rolled up and welded on the top, hence this spine. It's worth pointing out that some Mark I experimental types were also, they kind of worked with stamping the receiver. Those would actually have the weld on the bottom, but they didn't go much of anywhere. But Lyons Brothers, because of their experience, got it to work. On the bottom here, you'll notice there are 5 total vent ports. This one has the sling swivel. Those that didn't, these ports would also be used to hook the sling into. So by this point, the only really machined part of the gun, your trunnion, your barrel, and your bolt. Most of the lower trigger stuff is stamped. They even found a way to do away with the screws and the trigger dust cover. Even a simpler front sight is part of the rib versus the other one. Even simplified rear sight. These were cheaper, and they only took about 7 man-hours to machine out. And in some ways were more reliable than other previous versions too. This one appears, since it's on a US tube, it's a little different. He just kind of ventilated it here, so it doesn't have the rib. But this one, I actually found a kit with an intact receiver that was saw cut, so welded it back together. There's a few repair sections towards the middle, but the front is original, which is, I thought, really cool. And these would start off using the loop stock, but very soon they would switch to this. Meet the number 2 Mark III stock, also known as the T-stock, or the strut stock. Even simpler to produce, a little bit heavier. It's actually more durable than the Loop 2, but not as ergonomic. Some have the small sling swivel, others don't. This one I've got a grease gun sling on. While we're on it, this so-called commando pistol grip, this is a reproduction grip on this one, is actually patterned after an experimental grip that they tried. Again, these are all quick detachable, so the idea was for like urban warfare, paratroopers, they might want something that's not a stock. It's okay, but as you kind of saw me at the beginning, it's harder to charge the gun with, harder to hold it, and because of the Sten gun's safety record, you don't want to short stroke this bolt. Although later versions, they would start to fix that. But yeah, the Mark III, especially with the T-stock, is kind of the both high and low point of this gun. It's kind of the cheapest they were able to make it. And it would continue to march into combat. They would build just under 900,000 Mark IIIs, primarily 1942 and 1943. We looked at the paratrooper case that held 4 mags. Well, here is the standard infantry case, bandolier style. This holds 7 32-round magazines for a total of 224 rounds. That was standard loadout. And loaded up, this thing's about 10 pounds. It is very heavy, but it is a lot of ammunition. And this is what would have primarily been issued with the Mark I and Mark III, and sometimes Mark IIs if they were being used by more ground-based units. So from this point, things start to turn for the Sten, both in terms of reliability and quality. We come to the Sten Mark V. This is the one I've had for a long time, and the one that we always joke has furniture made from an old chifforobe. This is the most refined Sten. This is a late war. Just as with the Enfields, they started to improve manufacturing quality here, adding a little more spit and polish, because Well, it does a lot for morale. Myth says that these were kind of designed to look more like a Thompson. I'm not sure of that. I think they were just designed to look better. And it is based on the Mark II. Actually very similar. We have the two-piece receiver with the removable shroud. And we have the rotating magwell. And yeah, see, this one rotates fine. And still typically would use the same 32 round magazine. The lower is modified, still has two selector positions, but now it has a spot for a pistol grip, and it's a very vertical angled grip because we still have a removable stock in the back. This one has the sling loop on the top. I've seen a few different styles, and much like the original Lanchester, it has a storage compartment in the butt for cleaning gear. Interestingly, the stock does not have an infield style cutout, but I guess with the pistol grip it doesn't need it. Some of these had a small vertical stub grip too, but many didn't, and even the ones that did, it was removed because it was easily broken. The top here, and the sling mount here, more or less standard rear sight. Still has the J-hook. But we don't have a front sight here. Instead, they installed a number 4 Mark I infield, a windage adjustable and protected front sight, as well as the same bayonet lug. Both styles would fit blade and pig sticker. I just happened to dig out a pig sticker first. I'm not really sure how much this would be useful in combat, and it does kind of overhang the barrel a bit, but it's there. I guess it was something probably for more the kind of prisoner guard duty, because by this point when these were introduced, that was more of a factor. The Mark V first appeared in February of 1944, so just before D-Day, and would start to see field use that summer leading into 1945. As is famously known, these were available for Operation Market Garden and all of that. So by the end of the war, these were going into Europe. And these were actually built by Fazakerley and Thal, not by Enfield, and they weren't built in Canada. And production would end more or less with the war, building about 525,000. So smaller than the rest, except for the Mark I, but still not insignificant, over 500,000. And here is where we start to see several changes, improvements, and updates as well. One thing learned early on, when these went to North Africa, the sand and dust did not do well with these already finicky mags. So some would have these rods installed, 2 per side. You can see them sticking out here. And that effectively turned these into single stack, single feed mags of 20 rounds. So you're losing 12 rounds, but since it's a straight end feed, they were both easier to load and more reliable. So better to have 20 rounds reliable than 32 rounds of not. So you'll see some of these magazines with these inserts. Here's a kind of a British multi-purpose pack. It was originally made for the Bren gun, but it holds lots of stuff, including up to 6 Sten mags. Lots of pouches for these. Lots of fun. You would also see the finish change. The Mark I, Mark II, Mark III originally had just a more or less cheap chemical blue finish. With the Mark V, they would start to introduce a phosphate with a paint overlay finish, so paint and phosphate. And eventually a lot of the guns during refurbishment would get the famous British Sunkerite finish. And of course the wood is nothing special, but it's better than just a steel stock as well. So you're starting to see better fit and finish there. There's also something to talk about when it comes to the charging handle. Originally, the handle just went to the J-hook. But with the Mark IV handle, you could insert it in, locking it either in the forward position, meaning the bolt can no longer bounce back and forth on its own, or in the rear position. The receiver had a little hole, a little cutout. You could press this in. And you can notice the different shape of the handle. This is getting more of a mushroom shape so you can grab it, whereas the earlier ones are just more of a straight shape. And there's lots of variations in charging handles. Like I said too, with this one, some bolts were brass or bronze, but the metal would wear more quickly, leading to firing issues. So by the time of the Mark V, you're more or less seeing steel bolts all the time. And you'll see variations in the lower frame and cover here. This one has 2 screws. Later on, they would just be dimpled on. Lots of little changes like that, especially because these were made by a dozen factories with even more subcontractors, and that's not even counting production in places like Canada. As we near the end, I thought we'd line them all up, showing the progression. Again, it'd be great if I had a Mark I, but I don't, so c'est la vie. I do think the Lanchester deserves to be here, because it was the first, and mechanically very similar. The Mark II is certainly the most famous and popular. I just feel bad I can't find my display barrel because it looks a lot better with the short barrel, but oh well. And I'm actually still been very happy with how this Mark III pistol turned out because, yeah, the barrel's fixed in. There's no way to QD it. It's a shame it doesn't unscrew like on the Lanchester, so I could have a display barrel for it and not. But oh well. And then the Mark V. Of course, there was a Mark IV, but it was only a prototype. There was also the Mark III's, a suppressed version. And there were several foreign copies. I mean, Germany copied several, almost 30,000 Durer Potsdams that were basically exact Sten copies. There was also the MP 3008, which they made about 10,000 of in 1945, which was a vertical magazine version. And Poland would make some for the resistance during the war. Australia and Canada would make their own variants, leading to the own gun too in Australia. Israel would make some, especially early on when they were fighting in the 40s. And there. We really don't know how many Stens have been made because they were so simple. Originally it had well under 100 parts. By the time of the Mark III, under 50. Like I said at the beginning, it was about 12 man-hours to make originally, and that was nearly halved by 1943 down to 7 hours, although it would go up again in terms of parts and man-hours with the Mark V, but still not by a whole lot, frankly. Best estimates, somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5 million. And these would remain in service for quite some time. In Britain, they would be redesignated in the 1950s. Even though manufacturing was over, they were still in service. The Mark IIs were the L50. The Mark IIIs were the L51. And the Mark Vs were the L52. And of course, Germany had their own designation as they captured these MP 748, 749, and 750E, respectively. And other nations would call them names, sometimes happily, sometimes not. It had certainly a mixed bag, a mixed reputation that's really not worth the going into in this particular video, but it was a machine gun when Britain needed machine guns. And it would get safer over time with the new charging handle and new bolt system, and somewhat more reliable with better made magazines. And that really was the failure point more than anything else, was the magazine. But as I said at the beginning of the video, it still had lots of names like the Stench gun, Plumber's Nightmare, Plumber's Abortion, and some were kind of, ragging on it affectionately too. So it goes both ways. You can read horror stories and very good stories about it in equal measure. Either way, it stayed in British service through the 1960s, and in other service like Australia and New Zealand into the 70s. India also used them into the 70s. Canada would evolve it into their C1. And yeah, it's a submachine gun firing a common cartridge with a magazine that's still very easy to get. So what about these semi-autos? Well, the Sten is a good candidate for that because kits have been available for a very long time and very inexpensive, especially Mark IIIs and even Mark IIs. Mark Vs have always been a little more, but not crazy, at least until recently. You could even find several with intact barrels and partial receivers like I did with this Mark III. Even if not, making a tube, like you saw for the other Mark III, isn't a big deal because it is a common diameter. So those are the easy parts. It's also nice that you can do the display barrel thing. At least for the Mark IIs, Mark IIIs, and for that matter, the Lanchesters. Converting the trigger groups, well, the fact that they do have semi-auto in them, that's good, but you have to be careful because even the military guns, selecting from semi to full, was a risky proposition. Some would go full auto even on semi, some they reverse, some they didn't work at all. Again, cheap manufacturing. So if you do that, fine. You can do that making them into a striker-fired gun, because you also have to make them into closed bolt to comply with current regs since 1980. That's just where we're at. I've seen a few places like Valkyrie do hammer-fired versions, and that's another option, but the striker fire seems a little better to me because you're preserving more of the original sear and stuff. Personal taste. Although hammer fire is probably more reliable. So you do have to drill out the bolt, put a firing pin in because these are all fixed firing pins. Yada yada yada, and then do something about the barrel, either SBR, extend it, or make it into a pistol. Either way, they're not bad. It just requires some welding. What's kind of nice about a Sten, rough welds are not out of place, so you don't need to be a master welder to do these. In fact, if you made welds too clean, it'd look a little weird. So that's good. The same kind of goes for the riveting. The Lanchester, on the other hand, it's a little more of a pain in the ass. For one, kits have always been harder to find. And so most of us, mine included here, are actually built from the IMA dummy guns, display guns. Those are great for getting a stock, an end cap, a magwell, a barrel shroud, but they don't have the internals like the bolt and trigger pack. That's okay because a lot of them were full auto only. They were either Mark I stars or modified to be Mark I stars in service. So you almost need to use components from a Sten trigger pack in these anyway. And you can use a modified Sten bolt. And you can even use a modified Sten barrel if you need to, just shaving it down to fit into the Lanchester trunnion. My point is there's a lot more work that goes into a Lanchester, and the kits are harder to find. But it is a cool looking gun, I'll give it that. As far as finding its 50 round mags, good luck. I own exactly one. And normally I would have a full pouch full of anything I have, but they're just not available. They didn't make many, and they were easily damaged in service and thrown away and replaced with 32 round Sten gun mags. But yeah, it is a lot of fun, and it's a very iconic gun. I would say don't expect one of these to be 100% either reliable or safe, and that's because the military guns were not 100% reliable or safe. So if you build a semi-auto, make sure you handle it with all the rules in place, pointing it down range, because even the military guns were known for runaway fire and other fun issues. At any rate, the Sten gun is damn iconic, whatever you say. In the end, nothing says more about the Sten than its replacement, the Sterling. Yeah, kind of going back to the very beginning with the Lanchester, Sterling Company would come out with the Sterling submachine gun, the L2, A1, A2, A3. And this actually traces its roots back to the very end of World War II with the Patchett Mark I. This is one of my favorite guns of all time, and it really shows you that they like the basic concept and caliber. This is actually quite similar in a lot of ways to a Mark III. But the major update was really to the magazine. Curved style, with rollers in it, 34 rounds. This is one of the best submachine gun mags ever designed in the world. And of course it has pistol grip, folding stock. It's iconic in and of itself. Even takes a bayonet very similar to the jungle carbine. So in a lot of ways, the Lanchester and Sten kind of melded together and lived on in the Sterling, which Britain would use all the way through the 1990s, and some even lament today. And of course, this is my Mark VI carbine, imported in the 80s from Dagenham, England. Just an awesome gun, and there's plenty of the WWII light versions out there as well as parts kits. I like these spiral cuts in the bolt. It really does just show them refining everything they learned after other World War II submachine guns. And yeah, it's definitely in the running for the best submachine gun in the world. And that's kind of the lineage of British subguns that they made themselves, from the Lanchester to the Sterling. What do you think? Let's wrap it up. Well, hope you enjoyed the trip down memory lane and kind of looking at the gun that had a stock made out of a chifforobe. Still have that same Mark V. I don't know. They're just fun. My first semi-Sten was from Catco years ago, and wasn't great. So when I met MK Gun Mods, actually the first guns he built for me were Stens. I also had some built by Valkyrie Arms, who used to do the M3 grease guns. It's kind of funny that no big company has ever mass-produced these, considering how available the kits were. WWII, who did do the Sterlings, was about to do a Mark III S, but never did for various reasons. So unfortunately, what should be a pretty easy semi-auto gun to find and build, well, it just isn't. So with that, yeah, when this loop stock Mark III came in, just seemed like a good time to visit. Why not? So does anyone else own a Sten or a Sterling even? It's one of my favorites, the Sterling. Love to talk about it below. As always, please do like, share, and subscribe, comment, and if you like to, check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.